They called her queen for 9 days, and then she vanished from the spotlight forever. History remembers kings and queens who ruled for decades, but some reigned for only days, their stories buried beneath politics, ambition, and fear. This is the story of a girl who never wanted a crown, a scholar forced into power, a queen for just 9 days, and a teenager whose execution was carried out in near secrecy. Her name was Lady Jane Grey. Welcome back to Shadows of History. If hidden truths and untold stories are your thing, you're in exactly the right place. Before we get started, hit subscribe, drop a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Big welcome to all the new faces. And to my returning viewers, you're the legends keeping this going. Now, let's jump straight into today's story. It's a good one. Born around 1537, Lady Jane Grey was no ordinary noble. She was a timid, pale-haired girl with a fierce love for books. Educated in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, she was a prodigy, but her brilliance made her valuable, dangerously valuable. Jane was raised in an environment where learning was prized, but affection was not. Her parents saw her as a political instrument, a future pawn on the chessboard of Tudor power. By 1553, England faced a looming crisis. The young King Edward VI, Jane's cousin, was dying, and the next in line was his Catholic sister, Mary Tudor. The Protestant nobles feared what Mary's reign would mean. Edward was persuaded to change the succession, not to Mary, not even to Elizabeth, but to Lady Jane Grey. Jane never wanted it. She wept when she was told she would be queen, but her parents and the powerful Duke of Northumberland insisted. On July 10, 1553, Lady Jane Grey became Queen of England. She was only 16. She would reign for 9 days. Across England, the people rejected the new queen. They rallied behind Mary, the true heir. Within days, Mary raised an army. Jane's government collapsed almost instantly. The council abandoned her. She was left completely alone. Her father, one of the architects of her rise, switched sides to save himself. Northumberland too surrendered to Mary. On July 19th, just 9 days after Jane became queen, Mary Tudor seized the throne. Jane was arrested for treason. Mary was reluctant to execute her. Jane was only a girl and a victim of others' ambition, but rebellion changed everything. When Jane's father joined a failed uprising, Mary signed the death warrant. Jane was sentenced to die. February 11th, 1554. In her cold tower cell, Jane spent her final night praying and writing farewell letters. She showed remarkable composure. Witnesses described her as serene, almost relieved. Mary feared public sympathy for the young Protestant girl, so Jane's execution was arranged quietly, inside the Tower grounds, away from crowds, away from London's eyes. Jane delivered a final speech, brief, humble, unwavering. Then, blindfolded, she struggled to find the block. She was 17. Her death was swift, controlled, and intentionally hidden. A teenage queen erased almost as soon as she appeared. Soft footsteps. A torch flickers in a stone corridor. The camera follows a young girl's silhouette as she walks alone toward a heavy wooden door. History remembers kings and queens as titans, rulers who reshaped nations with iron wills and flaming tempers. But there exists, hidden between the towering reigns of Henry VIII and Mary V, a monarch whose crown lasted only 9 days, a monarch barely 16 years old, a monarch who did not fight for the throne, but was placed upon it like a lamb led unknowingly into a storm. She is Lady Jane Grey, England's most tragic sovereign, a queen of paper rather than power. Her reign, short as a breath. Her death, the silent climax of the Tudor dynasty's darkest gamble. Tonight, we go beyond the legend, beyond the schoolbook summaries, beyond the polite lines of royal genealogy. This is the full, untold, unfiltered documentary of Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day Queen, a girl forced into the epicenter of treacherous plots, religious extremism, political collapse, and a kingdom tearing itself apart. Lady Jane Grey entered the world in October 1537. The same month, Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's beloved third wife, gave birth to Prince Edward, the future King Edward VI. The two infants, born into different branches of the Tudor bloodline, would one day find their fates intertwined so tightly that one's death would signal the rise and destruction of the other. Jane was born to Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, and Lady Frances Brandon, niece of Henry VIII. She was a member of the extended royal family, but not raised with the expectation of queenship. However, the Tudor world was not one of gentle parenting. The age was sharp with ambition, driven by fear of court politics and terror of falling out of favour. Jane's parents were strict, sometimes cruel, believing only harsh discipline could prepare a child for royal proximity. Yet Jane's innermost world was shaped not by power or pride, but by scholarship. She found comfort in books, languages, and theology. By age 10, she read Greek. By 13, she debated Protestant doctrine with the sharpness of an academic twice her age. She was never meant to be a queen. She was meant to be a thinker. But in Tudor England, bloodlines mattered far more than personal dreams. The turning point in Jane's life came not through her own choices, but through the declining health of her cousin, King Edward VI, Henry VIII's long-desired male heir. Edward was brilliant, devoutly Protestant, and gravely ill. By the early months of 1553, it was clear he was dying of a respiratory infection, likely tuberculosis. England panicked. Why? Because the next in line was not Protestant. It was Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's Catholic daughter. To Edward's council of Protestant reformers, Mary's ascension represented nothing less than the destruction of everything they had built: the Protestant Church, the dissolution of monasteries, the English Bible, the new religious identity crafted during the Reformation. The most powerful of these reformers was John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, the man who effectively ruled England during Edward's final years. Northumberland was not a man of conscience. He was a man of calculation. He saw in Mary a threat. He saw in Edward's illness a crisis. And in Lady Jane Grey, he saw an opportunity. In the dimly lit chambers of Whitehall Palace, as Edward's body failed and his council grew frantic, the most daring political plot of the Tudor century began to take shape. Edward VI, fearful of a Catholic reversal, drafted a document known as My devise for the succession. This document attempted to override the parliamentary acts that placed Mary and Elizabeth next in line. In its first form, Edward tried to name the male heirs of Lady Frances Brandon, but there were no male heirs, so the document was amended. It now declared, "And, for lack of such issue, the Lady Jane Grey shall be heir to the crown." There it was, the key. Jane Grey, barely 16, placed above both Mary and Elizabeth. But there is a darker secret behind this decision. Northumberland had already arranged Jane's marriage to his son, Guildford Dudley, only weeks before Edward's final illness. A coincidence, or the final piece in a carefully constructed coup? Historians still argue, but the timing suggests orchestration, not chance. On July 6, 1553, King Edward VI died at age 15. His death was withheld from the public for 3 days while Northumberland and the council prepared. Then, in the Tower of London, Lady Jane Grey was summoned. She arrived, assuming she was to be consulted on the succession, perhaps asked to support Mary or Elizabeth. Instead, she was greeted by armed guards, councillors, her own parents, and Northumberland. Then came the words, "Jane, you are the new Queen of England." Witnesses recorded her reaction, disbelief, then shock, then tears. She reportedly said, "The crown is not my right. I will not take it." But her mother, her father, and Northumberland pressed her relentlessly. They invoked God. They invoked duty. They invoked the dying wishes of Edward VI, whether truthfully or not. For a teenage girl raised in obedience, surrounded by authority, there was no way out. And so, in that chamber, trembling and grieving, Jane Grey became Queen of England. On July 10th, 1553, Lady Jane Grey was formally proclaimed Queen. Cannons thundered from the Tower. Her name was shouted across the city, yet beneath the noise lay an uneasy silence. The people of London did not cheer, they watched, they waited. Because the true heir, Mary Tudor, had already fled and was gathering armies in East Anglia. Jane's council collapses instantly. Jane sat upon the throne. But in reality she held no power. Her councillors argued. Her parents pushed her to make her husband Guildford king. Her father-in-law Northumberland demanded she sign documents she barely understood. Still, she showed flashes of remarkable intelligence. She vetoed Guildford's coronation, declaring, "The crown cannot be given by marriage, but only by the people and the law." This act demonstrated a political awareness beyond her years, but it also deepened resentment around her. Guildford felt insulted. Northumberland was furious. Even her parents grew frustrated. While Jane struggled in London, Mary Tudor executed the greatest political comeback in Tudor history. Mary, misjudged as weak, proved far more cunning than her enemies imagined. She rallied thousands of supporters. Entire towns and nobles declared for her. Catholics and Protestants alike united behind the legitimacy of her claim. Within a week, her forces dwarfed those of Northumberland. As Mary's army marched toward London, council members began defecting from Jane's government, first in whispers, then in open declarations. Northumberland panicked. He marched out of London to intercept Mary, leaving Jane abandoned. It was a catastrophic mistake. Without him, his entire political plan crumbled. On July 19, 1553, Less than 2 weeks after Jane's coronation, the council switched allegiance. The people of London erupted in celebration at the news that Mary Tudor was now Queen. Mary the bells crashed in every church tower. Crowds flooded the streets. The city, silent during Jane's proclamation, now roared with life. Inside the Tower of London, Jane was informed she was no longer Queen. Her reign had lasted 9 days. She responded quietly, "I am glad to depart from the honour of the crown." She was escorted back to her rooms, not as a monarch, but as a prisoner. At first, Mary showed extraordinary mercy. She understood that Jane had been a pawn, manipulated by men hungry for power. Mary vowed not to execute the young girl. Even Northumberland, the architect of the coup, received a legal trial. But this mercy would not last, for in early 1554 a rebellion erupted, Wyatt's Rebellion, a Protestant uprising against Mary's proposed marriage to the Catholic Prince Philip of Spain. Although Jane took no part, her name became a rallying cry. She was a symbol of Protestant legitimacy. Mary's advisers argued, as long as Jane Grey lives, she will be a threat. Rebellion will rise in her name again and again. Mary agonized over the decision. She prayed. She sought counsel. But fear outweighed compassion, and Jane's fate was sealed. On February 12, 1554, Lady Jane Grey was led from her cell to Tower Green, where private executions were held. Witnesses described her as calm, composed, deeply devout. She delivered a short final speech, stating, "I do wash my hands thereof in innocence before God and the face of you all." Then she blindfolded herself. She struggled momentarily to find the block, whispering, "What shall I do? Where is it?" A bystander guided her hand. She knelt, she prayed, the axe fell, and with it the hopes and fears of a kingdom caught between faiths. Jane was 16 years old. Meet Lady Jane Grey, only about 16 when politics crowned her queen in 1553. Within days, Mary Tudor reclaimed the throne, and Jane became a prisoner in the Tower. Branded a pawn in a deadly power play, she faced a private execution in February 1554. No public spectacle, just a hush behind castle walls. Her fate turned her into a tragic symbol, a child of ambition, religion, and ruthless Tudor politics. On the cold morning of February 12, 1554, the executioner's axe silenced the life of a girl who had never sought the throne, yet the echoes of that blow shook England for decades. The immediate aftermath of Lady Jane Grey's death was not triumph nor closure, it was discomfort. Even among supporters of Mary, there was unease. Jane had not been a villain. She had not plotted treason. She had been used. Her death forced England to confront a truth that still haunts Tudor history. Power in the 16th century was ruthless, and innocence offered no protection. Jane's husband, Guildford Dudley, was executed the same morning. Some chroniclers say Mary wished to spare Jane, but not her husband. Others claim eliminating both was necessary to extinguish the rebellion's symbolic power. Either way, the Dudley name, once the most influential in the realm, became synonymous with ambition gone too far. Lady Jane Grey's parents, Henry Grey and Frances Brandon, survived temporarily, But Henry Grey would later join another rebellion and be executed as well. Frances remarried quickly, eager to distance herself from the events that doomed her daughter. In the halls of power, grief did not linger long. The Tudors never had the luxury of mourning. Survival demanded movement. Forward, always forward. While later centuries romanticized Jane as a martyr or saint, her own time grappled with political embarrassment. Mary I's dilemma. Mary Tudor, now queen in full, understood that Jane's death reflected poorly on her rule. Executing a teenage girl, especially a girl of learning, grace, and public sympathy, was politically hazardous. Mary's Catholic supporters defended her decision as necessary for stability. Protestants, however, saw Jane as a legitimate monarch who had been murdered. Foreign diplomats wrote cautiously, often omitting Jane entirely, as if erasing her from the narrative could prevent international criticism. Mary's advisers urged her to control the story, and so, in official accounts, Jane became. But the truth, as always, was far more complex. To understand Jane's rise and fall, we must explore the forces that put her on the throne. Forces far older than her, larger than her, and immeasurably more dangerous. The ambition of John Dudley, Northumberland's full plan, was audacious. It was not about Protestantism alone. It was about power. If Jane reigned, Northumberland would govern England through her and Guildford. This was not speculation. It was strategy. Chronicles reveal he assumed the people would follow. He was wrong. Though manipulated, Edward Negenka did genuinely believe Mary's succession threatened England. His religious zeal, intense for his age, drove him to rewrite his father's legal settlement. Edward wanted a Protestant nation. Jane was not merely convenient. She was aligned with his faith. She was educated by the same Protestant scholars he admired. In Edward's dying mind, Jane was England's future. Mary was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, a devout Catholic. She had suffered humiliation for her faith and vowed to restore Catholicism if she ever reached the throne. To Protestant nobles, her ascension meant Jane was not only a candidate they preferred, she was a safeguard against Mary's expected religious purge. Thus, Jane's rise was not one decision, but the intersection of a dying king's fears, a counsellor's ambition, a nation divided by faith, and a girl caught in the crossfire. History often paints Lady Jane Grey as a saint, a scholar, a victim, a martyr, a Protestant icon, a tragic princess. But who was she really? A scholar above all else. Jane's letters, writings, and accounts from contemporaries paint the picture of a brilliant, introspective mind. One of the most learned women in England, she corresponded with leading reformers. She translated Greek and Latin texts. She had a command of scripture that shocked even bishops. Her theological arguments during her imprisonment remain among the most articulate of her age. A girl forced to obey Jane's own words reveal a life shaped by strict parental dominance. She once wrote, "I think myself in hell, for I am chastised with sharp and cruel stripes." Her obedience was carved into her through fear. Thus, when the crown was forced upon her, she resisted, but ultimately yielded. a monarch of principle. During her 9 days, she refused to make her husband king. She refused to sign certain documents without understanding them. She refused to accept Mary's claim even when threatened. These were not the actions of a puppet, but of a principled young woman facing impossible pressure. Lady Jane's story cannot be told without understanding the religious divide tearing England apart. Protestant versus Catholic. The Reformation had reshaped England rapidly under Henry VIII and Edward VI, but Mary I sought to reverse it, fully and decisively. Jane's brief reign represented the last attempt of the Protestant minority to block Mary's Catholic restoration. When Jane died, Mary proceeded to. Jane in death became a symbol of Protestant faith, both genuinely and in propaganda. Her writings from prison, especially her letter to her sister Catherine, were circulated widely after her execution. In them, Jane urged steadfast belief in Protestant doctrine. For Protestants, Jane became the first Protestant martyr queen. After Elizabeth I descended in 1558, Jane's reputation was rehabilitated rapidly. Elizabeth's court elevated Jane as a martyr. Elizabeth I, a Protestant queen, had every political reason to portray Mary VI's reign, known later as the Marian persecutions, as cruel and misguided. Jane became a perfect symbol. Elizabeth never officially declared Jane a queen, but she allowed, even encouraged, stories that cast Jane as a Protestant martyr. Centuries later, during the 1800s, public fascination with Tudor history exploded. Lady Jane Grey's story became the subject of the most famous is Paul Delaroche's 1833 masterpiece, The Execution of Lady Jane Grey, a dramatic, emotional depiction, historically inaccurate but culturally influential. Victorians adored Jane because she embodied their ideals. Thus, the real Jane, intelligent, principled, politically aware, was overshadowed by a softer, more sentimental version. Modern historians have worked to reclaim the truth of Jane's life. Jane was intelligent, not passive. She understood the stakes of her position. Her letters show political insight and religious devotion far beyond her age. She was a pawn, but not a fool. She resisted certain political pressures, especially regarding Guildford's kingship. She was a victim of larger forces. Those forces included, she deserves recognition as a real monarch. Though her reign was short, Lady Jane Grey issued proclamations, signed documents, and was recognized by parts of England. By many historians' standards, she was Queen of England, if only for 9 days. Lady Jane Grey remains one of the most compelling figures in English history, not for her deeds on the throne, but for the forces that carried her to it. Her story teaches us that not every ruler seeks power, not every monarch is born to rule, and sometimes the greatest tragedies are written not by villains, but by circumstance. Imagine for a moment a different world. A world where Edward VI survived. A world where Mary Tudor fled or yielded. A world where Jane Grey lived long enough to shape policy, to rule with wisdom, to expand learning, to become the scholar queen England never had. Would England have embraced her gentler, religious vision? Would the shift back to Catholicism, and later to Protestantism have been less violent? Would her intelligence and moral conviction have produced a less turbulent era? We will never know. History is cruel in its uncertainties, but it is generous in its remembrance. Today, Lady Jane Grey is studied not as a failed monarch, but as a remarkable young woman who became the unwilling centre of one of England's greatest constitutional crises. Her reign was brief, her life tragic, but her memory lives across centuries, painted, written, analysed, and mourned. She is the queen who never wanted a crown, the queen who never stood a chance, the queen who will never be forgotten. Lady Jane Grey's story does not belong to the victors or the vanquished. It belongs to all who seek to understand how power shapes destiny, and how innocence can be caught in its relentless tide. Her 9 days as queen are a whisper in the long history of the English crown, but her courage, her intellect, and her tragic fate echo across time. This has been the untold history of Lady Jane Grey, England's 9-day queen. Lady Jane Grey remains one of England's most tragic figures, a brilliant young woman manipulated by adults, forced into a crown she never sought, and executed in secret to protect a fragile throne. If she had lived, history might remember her differently, but perhaps her quiet strength, even at the end, is her true legacy. This is the story of the teenage queen who ruled for 9 days and died so her name might be forgotten. Subscribe and dive into the mystery next. I want to appreciate those who support this channel by buying a coffee. We are grateful.